There's a specific kind of contentment that some people experience when they're finally alone. Not the relief of escaping something unpleasant, the genuine satisfaction of being exactly where they want to be. With no one, doing nothing in particular, and feeling perfectly fine about it. It's invisible to people who need constant stimulation. It looks like loneliness from the outside, like something is missing. But from the inside, it feels complete, not empty, but full. Just in a way that doesn't require an audience. Maybe you know someone like this. Maybe it's you. That person who can spend an entire weekend alone and emerge feeling energized rather than starved for connection. Who never says, "I'm bored," because their mind is always engaged with something. Who doesn't need plans or people or external entertainment to feel like their time has value. And when people ask, "Don't you get lonely?" they genuinely don't understand the question. Because loneliness and aloneness are not the same thing. Most people assume that spending extensive time alone means something is wrong. That people who don't get bored by themselves are either depressed, antisocial, or somehow disconnected from what makes life meaningful. But psychology tells a very different story. For people with rich inner worlds, solitude isn't deprivation, it's restoration. It's not the absence of stimulation, it's the presence of a different kind of stimulation. Internal rather than external, self-generated rather than socially provided. And for nervous systems wired this way, that internal stimulation is not just sufficient, it's often preferable. Research in personality psychology shows that people who report high satisfaction with solitude tend to have what psychologists call high internal complexity. Their minds naturally generate thoughts, ideas, questions, connections. They don't need the external world to provide interest because their internal world is inherently interesting. What if solitude isn't something you endure? What if it's something you cultivate? When you have a mind that's constantly processing, connecting ideas, exploring possibilities, solitude becomes something different than what most people experience. For someone who needs external stimulation, being alone means nothing is happening. No conversation, no entertainment, no interaction, just silence and emptiness. But for someone with an active internal world, being alone means everything is happening. Thoughts connecting to other thoughts, ideas building on previous ideas, questions leading to deeper questions. The mind isn't waiting for something to engage with. It's already engaged with itself. Research on introspection and self-reflection shows that people who spend significant time in solitary thought develop enhanced self-awareness and cognitive complexity. They understand their own thinking processes more deeply. They make connections between concepts that require sustained attention. They develop ideas that need uninterrupted time to fully form. This isn't avoidance of the external world, it's engagement with the internal one. And for some cognitive styles, that internal engagement is where the most meaningful work happens. This capacity usually develops early, though most people don't recognize it as unusual until much later. As children, these are the kids who can play alone for hours, who create elaborate imaginary worlds, who get lost in books and emerge hours later barely aware that time has passed. Adults often interpret this as shyness or social difficulty. They worry the child isn't developing social skills. They encourage more playdates, more group activities, more external engagement. But for the child, the solitary play isn't compensation for lack of friends. It's a genuine preference. Their imagination provides richer engagement than most social interactions offer. And as they grow older, that preference doesn't disappear. It just becomes more sophisticated. The imaginary worlds become internal dialogues. The solitary play becomes solitary work, thought creation. The capacity to be alone without being bored becomes a defining feature of how they move through the world. Here's what neuroscience reveals about this experience. Studies using brain imaging show that people who prefer solitude demonstrate different patterns of neural activity during rest. Their default mode network, the brain system active during internally focused thought, shows higher baseline activity. Even when they're not engaged in a specific task, their minds are actively processing, making connections, exploring ideas, generating thoughts. For these individuals, the brain doesn't experience unstimulated time as boring. It experiences it as opportunity. Opportunity to think without interruption, to process without external demands, to follow thoughts wherever they lead without having to explain or justify or pause for someone else's input. This is why people with rich inner worlds often say that social interaction, even enjoyable social interaction, is cognitively expensive. Not because they dislike people, but because external engagement requires suppressing the internal engagement that's already happening. They have to pause their own thoughts to track someone else's. They have to redirect attention outward when it naturally flows inward. And while they can do this, and often do it well, it costs something. It requires energy that solitude doesn't require. We live in a culture that treats constant stimulation as normal, and solitude as something to fix. Silence is filled with podcasts. Alone time is interrupted by notifications. Empty moments are treated as opportunities for productivity rather than thinking. Your ancestors had long stretches of quiet, time alone with their thoughts during repetitive tasks, space for the mind to wander without being pulled in 12 directions. You have a culture that pathologizes boredom and celebrates busyness, that asks, "What did you do this weekend?" as if doing nothing is somehow wasteful. That treats rich inner life as less valuable than visible external activity. So people who are genuinely content alone often hide it. They make up plans to sound normal. They downplay how much they enjoy solitude because admitting it makes others uncomfortable. They've learned that saying "I spent the weekend thinking" doesn't count as a valid answer, even though, for them, it was the most engaging thing they could have done. There's a particular kind of misunderstanding that people with rich inner worlds face constantly. When they choose solitude, others interpret it as loneliness. When they seem content alone, others assume they're in denial about what they're missing. When they don't get bored, others think they're just better at tolerating boredom. But they're not tolerating anything. They're genuinely engaged. Their minds are active even when their bodies are still. Their thoughts provide connection even when no other person is present. Their internal world offers complexity that most external entertainment can't match. Behind every "I'm fine being alone" is not resignation. It's honest preference, not settling for solitude because connection isn't available. Choosing solitude because it offers something connection doesn't. Space to think deeply. Freedom to follow curiosity without explanation. Time to process experiences without interruption. Not isolation. Immersion, not loneliness. Engagement. Many people who never feel bored alone aren't antisocial. They're selectively social. They enjoy meaningful conversation with people who can match their depth. They value relationships where silence is comfortable and thoughts can be shared without performance. They appreciate connection that doesn't require constant interaction to maintain, but they don't need social contact to feel like their time has purpose. Because purpose, for them, comes from engagement, and engagement can happen entirely internally. And here's what makes this hard to explain to people who don't experience it. The internal world isn't fantasy or escapism. It's where real thinking happens, where ideas develop from vague intuition into coherent understanding, where experiences get processed into insight, where questions get explored without the pressure of immediate answers. People with rich inner lives aren't disconnected from reality. They're deeply connected to the part of reality that exists in thought, meaning, and understanding. The part that requires quiet to access. What's rarely acknowledged is how productive this internal engagement can be. Many of the world's most significant innovations came from people who spent extensive time alone with their thoughts. Not because solitude made them smarter, but because certain kinds of thinking require sustained, uninterrupted attention. Deep work, as productivity researchers call it, happens in the absence of distraction. Original ideas emerge when the mind has space to make unexpected connections. Creative breakthroughs occur when thoughts can develop without constant external interruption. Research on creativity and solitude shows that people who regularly engage in solitary reflection demonstrate higher creative output. Not because they're avoiding collaboration, but because creation requires both input from others and space to synthesize that input into something new. And synthesis happens internally, in the quiet moments when the mind can work without interruption. So if you're someone who genuinely enjoys being alone, who never runs out of things to think about, who finds solitude energizing rather than draining, you're not broken, you're internally complex. You didn't fail at being social, you succeeded at being self-sufficient. Maybe the shift isn't learning to need people more. Maybe it's recognizing that your rich inner world is a strength, not a deficit. Maybe it's understanding that constant external stimulation isn't a sign of a full life. Sometimes it's a sign of an empty internal one. Maybe it's accepting that you're wired to find meaning internally, and that wiring doesn't need fixing. It needs honoring, because boredom isn't the absence of external activity. It's the absence of engagement, and engagement can come from anywhere, from conversation with others, or from conversation with yourself, from external experiences, or from internal exploration, from what the world provides, or from what your mind creates. The people who never feel bored alone haven't learned to tolerate emptiness. They've discovered that solitude isn't empty. It's full of thoughts that need thinking, ideas that need developing, questions that need exploring, experiences that need processing. And all of that requires time, uninterrupted time, time that belongs entirely to the internal world. So when people ask, "Don't you get lonely?" or "What do you even do all day?" or "Aren't you bored?" you're not avoiding the truth. You're living a truth they don't have access to. The truth that your mind is enough company, that your thoughts are enough engagement, that your internal world is rich enough that external emptiness doesn't register as deprivation. There will still be moments when connection feels important, when you want to share an idea with someone who can understand it, when you crave conversation that matches your depth. That's okay. That's not contradiction. That's being human. But there will also be long stretches when solitude feels perfect, when being alone is exactly what you need, when the absence of external demands creates space for the internal work that matters most to you. And you'll realize that you're not missing anything. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, engaged with a world that most people never access, the world inside your own mind. Maybe that's the deepest truth about self-sufficient introverts. They're not afraid of being alone. They're comfortable with who they find there. They don't need external validation because their internal world provides its own rewards. They don't get bored because boredom requires emptiness. And their minds are anything but empty. Not lonely, complete, not isolated, engaged, not missing out, deeply present with themselves. Until then, walk gently with yourself. Your capacity for solitude isn't a flaw, it's a gift. And the world needs people who can think deeply, who can sit with complexity, who can create meaning from silence. And this person is you.